When people tend to look at your drawing, or they when you're younger, you have like your parents or a teacher or some friend or whatever. I remember when I was a kid, at least, a lot of the compliments that I get would be based around, "Oh, that's so detailed. Oh, that looks so good. There's so many little details in there. Oh, good work, little buddy." Um, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard that sort of thing too. I mean, it's irrelevant as to whether or not your work was actually detailed. It's often something that they call out. And so people in general tend to have a bit of an obsession with detail because that's something that uh, others can really latch onto as being something that is present in a drawing. And as such, when we're learning to draw, we have a tendency to focus a little bit too much on getting into the detail, getting into all of that. And so I'm a little bit reluctant to cover detail and texture as part of this lesson, but I do feel that it's at least worth touching on. That said, construction and the kind of underlying parts with the simple forms that you put together to create a more complex object, that is so much more important than texture and detail. You can have a well constructed object with no detail whatsoever and it will still look good. But if you have a highly detailed object with minimal to no real construction, it falls flat, it does not look three-dimensional, and so on, it's not going to be able to stand on its own. So keep that in mind, and don't worry too much about detail as you continue to progress through the lessons. It is something that we'll steadily work on, but it really is not your priority right now, by which I mean to say it's not my priority. And my priorities are your priorities because you're following my instructions. Anyway, so when we talk about detail, it's worth talking about how humans look at things and how they remember. Humans have evolved over the millennia to be very good at surviving. I mean, we've done it this far. And the reason that we survive so well, or one of the many reasons, is that our brains will throw away most of the information that is not integral to that survival. So when you see an angry tiger in the jungle, you do not need to care about the color of its fur or the way the stripes are arranged over its body. You see that tiger, you register that it's a big scary cat thing, and you get out of there. Your brain does not care about all the little things, and it just registers big scary cat thing, here's the general shape of it, let's go. So as soon as you register that thing, it may for a split second see a lot of the information that's there, but it's immediately going to process that information, throw out the bulk of it, and leave all that it needs to survive. And the problem is that everything it's throwing out is actually what we need in order to be able to draw it. A lot of the even how the various components of its body fit together, how its neck fits into its torso, and how its legs, how many joints its legs even have. We don't remember that very well, not unless we're really sitting down to specifically observe and study a tiger. So what we do maintain in our brains are these things called symbols, and they're just representative of what we see. So when you think about a tree initially, you might think of something like this, or maybe even, the good old bubbly thing with a simple trunk. And when you think of a house, you might think of a square with a triangle on top of it for a roof, and this might be what you think of for a car. Obviously, it's not what you actually think of, but when you go to draw it, that's literally all the information that you have initially. So we make a habit of working from reference or from life, and both are very valuable. So that's definitely the first step to being able to really get a lot more of that information in. But even when we draw from reference, we have a tendency to really study and look at it closely and gather all our information, and then we go and sit down to draw. And we draw for a long time, and then we may look back at our reference for a little bit again, and then draw for a long time. The problem with that is that The moment we look away from that reference, our brain starts getting to work throwing away that unnecessary information, and it just casts it to the wind. That's just how it works. So it's extremely important that we get used to looking at our reference frequently. When I say frequently, I literally mean you draw a couple lines, a couple marks that you are specifically trying to transfer from your reference, meaning you saw the specific object or specific detail that you were trying to carry over, and you draw those couple marks, and then you go back to looking at your reference. Observe 90% of the time, that's a bit of an arbitrary number, but I really mean most of the time. Draw 10% of the time. You don't want to spend most of your time drawing. You really do need that time spent studying your reference, looking at how, not only what visual elements are present on an object, but how they're arranged. Like you might have forms that are very evenly distributed over a surface, or you might have them kind of clustered. You might have varying sizes. There's a lot to take in, and oftentimes a student who has not paid enough attention to their reference to really analyze the kind of groupings and rhythms and flows that are present will deal instead in drawing chaotically, using scribbly kind of, just getting those marks on the page. And the thing is, randomness is very obvious, and it tends to look bad. Everything that you're going to be drawing has some sort of logic or flow or rhythm to it. You may not be able to see it immediately, but you need to look closer and find it before you put any marks down that will be committed. And so even if you have like messy hair itself, it collects into these clumps, into locks of hair, and they all start to flow together. That was bad. Rather than, everything being on its own. All this about your memory is currently true, assuming you haven't worked on it yourself. That doesn't mean that it's going to be true forever. The very act of drawing from reference is going to gradually train your brain. It's going to rewire how you think and how you remember things into remembering more important details. It's still never going to be perfect, and reference will always be better if it's available. But if you study a certain subject matter enough, it's going to start getting written to what is called your visual library. And that's where we store a lot of information on really just everything. For example, you might really have studied how hinges work and how hinges fit together. It's not a detail, it's a constructional understanding, but it's not something that we inherently have. And you study it, you work at it, and it gets stowed away so that later on when you're designing a mech or some sort of machinery, you know exactly how these hinges would work, and so you can incorporate it in. You might have a very strong understanding of how a tiger's stripes are arranged on their body, and that's something that's squirreled away in the visual library. So you're not always going to be working so strictly from reference, but you really should never look at reference as a weakness, and you should never strive to say that one day I won't ever need reference, because that's not really the goal. The goal is to be able to work with whatever tools you have on hand. If you need reference for something, and if you're able to get it, that's great. You should still long-term be in a position to work without it, but the way that you get there is by continually working with reference to record that information and to keep it in your brain. Moving on from that, many of you will notice that we don't really tackle any sort of shading in Drawabox. A lot of your basic drawing courses, the fundamentals of drawing and all that you get at like night school or art school or in high school, they actually start out with that stuff. They will, have you draw a sphere, and they'll teach you about your core shadows and your bounce light and your ambient light and whatever else, your specular highlight. I don't want you to care about that at all right now. Reason being, Shading is frequently used as a student's only resort for making something feel three-dimensional. I'm arming you with a much better tool to achieve that goal, construction, which we'll get into later. It's going to be the next section. But when students are allowed to use shading at all, they will usually fall back on it because that's another one of those things that people tend to kind of call out when someone who's not an artist looks at your drawing and they see that there's shading. Oh, they'll say, oh, that's shaded very nicely. It's one of those things that we get as compliments, and so it becomes inherent to what we strive for. And so it's very easy to fall into the trap where when something doesn't feel solid, you just add more and more shading, and that's not going to fix the problem. The problem is in your construction. It's in your understanding of how the forms relate to each other, rather than how you understand how light plays around them. That's a secondary issue that really doesn't end up being that important. If you have a strong construction to begin with, you're already going to remarkably and surprisingly understand a good deal of how light is going to work, because you already understand how these objects sit in a scene, in a three-dimensional scene, and how light might interact with it, because light is literally just, it functions as though you shot a bullet in a room and it bounced off a bunch of surfaces, sort of. That's an oversimplification, but it's very similar to that. If you understand the physics and the way a room is set up, or a scene is set up, it's actually pretty easy to figure out a lot of the major points about light. You can come back and learn more about that, and that'll certainly help you, but it's not necessary right now. What you need to focus on is building that understanding of the three-dimensional world you're working in, and how all the forms that you draw and work with sit inside of it. So as you can see here, trying to solve a problem of drawing two boxes stacked on each other with shading alone is not going to get you very far, but because these still feel flimsy and indistinct. But doing so with construction alone gets you where you need to go. Now, the reason that I'm talking about that is actually because we do deal with one kind of shadow, cast shadows. Because a texture that you find on the surface of an object, it's not just a bunch of lines that have been drawn on it. Like if you find a fish, it's got a bunch of scales on it, and it's not just lines that you've drawn on that fish. Every single scale is a tiny little form that exists on its surface, and it casts a shadow. It has an impact somehow on all the other small forms around it. Instead of drawing every single scale in its entirety, as a lot of beginners will do, they'll outline every single scale, draw a little ellipse there for them. Ta-da, I've got my little scales and it's done, and I've drawn so many of them. Aren't you proud of me? Now here what they're doing is they're enclosing every single scale completely, which doesn't leave us a lot of room for playing with that texture as more of a tool. Here, if you're kind of laying in every single, the entire enclosing of every single one of these little forms, I'll show you in a moment how it takes away a lot of the control that you have. Here instead, we can understand that the lines that we see when we look at a fish are in fact not lines, but they are shadows cast by these forms. The thing about shadows is that they have a number of big advantages for us. First of all, shadows don't exist enclosing any object. They're not like this. Instead, you see them more tending towards one side of the object, not necessarily the whole thing. Secondly, shadows are not simple flat lines. They are actually shapes. So you can see how these shapes are extending well beyond the scale that casts them. And they're actually melding in with other shadow shapes that exist, creating these larger swaths of shadow. This actually becomes very useful when we start talking about detail density. Because as you can see right here, all these shadows have come together to create a single solid shape, which is only defined, like the contents of that shape. There's little, like in this case, it's rocks. There are little pebbles and things present here, but they are only implied by the way the edge of these shapes are carved. So instead of, having a flat nondescript section, there are little shapes carved out of it, little forms. And this suggests to us what is actually present in this shaded out area. The reason that we need to be careful about our density, and frankly, the reason that we need to be able to control it, is because we don't always want to go full on in as much dense detail as we can manage, because it becomes very, very distracting. Texture and detail are just tools for communicating what the surface of a form is like. If every single surface is so heavily detailed with all these little bits of white against black, strong juxtaposition of white and black to create very high contrast areas, it's going to be screaming at the viewer's eye. And your job is essentially to help guide the viewer's eye around what you've created. And so if everything is a focal point, the viewer doesn't know what to pay attention to. So we need to be able to transition from dense areas of detail, like this, to sparser areas of detail where it's not nearly as distracting or noisy. And that is another reason why not enclosing all of your, in this case, I guess, rocks, in a solid line is very useful, because you can see how these things bleed into each other. The greatest thing that I find about using cast shadows is the fact that when you shine a direct light at an object, that light is going to blast away all of this extra shadow, resulting in these kinds of lost and found lines, or lost and found shadows, which don't necessarily have to work all the way around the form to imply the form that is present. Because of that, you can allow them to bleed into each other, as we've done here. So anyway, what you want to take away from all of that is the idea that texture is primarily made up of very tiny forms, and instead of drawing the forms themselves, you want to capture the shadow that they cast on their surrounding environment. This is going to take a great deal of practice, and before you're even able to get to this stage where you're organizing all of your shadows, you have to focus on even just being able to identify the visual elements that are present, how they're arranged, and just really getting that down before you even worry about all of this density and sparseness. So what I was saying before about very dense, distracting focal areas everywhere with like such dense detail, while that is not our end goal, it is a valid thing to be studying first. And when you look at the actual texture exercise that is at the end of this section, you will find that the first thing that we do is that we try and go in as much dense detail as we can to study the texture. And then we use the information that we've accumulated from that process to apply to a sort of graduated scale here, where we're going from very dense to more sparse. But I get into that in that exercise, and that's what this image is actually from. There is still one last thing that I want to mention in regards to texture. It's the silhouette. When you have a form that has a bunch of tiny surface forms on it, you do not want to end up in a situation where you're depicting all of those forms in here, but this side here remains completely flat and smooth. Reason being, you're already telling the eye in this area that there are bumps, there are irregularities. Therefore, those same irregularities should be present here. More so, Even if you didn't have these internal details, the silhouette is such a powerful tool to convey detail in a very simple, subtle, understated way that the internal detail really doesn't matter all that much. You can add a little bit here and there, but the silhouette, anything that you convey and communicate along the silhouette by breaking those edges and making the shape more irregular, will immediately convey a strong illusion of whatever surface texture is present. And the reason for that is that when we look at something with our eyes, we do not see all the stuff inside first. We essentially see shapes, just cut out shapes of whatever the silhouette is. So if you're looking at a person who's carrying a bag or something, you might see something like this, but filled in. That's clearly a very simplistic example. You might see something like this. Anything that breaks this silhouette is immediately going to be picked up by your eye because it's the first thing it sees. So maybe their hairstyle, maybe they've got some weird stuff going on with, unkempt hair. You're going to notice that because it's breaking the silhouette, and that's the first thing your eye sees. Anything after that, anything later on in the process of looking at something and processing it visually is going to have less impact on your understanding of it. So if you can get some piece of information into the silhouette, it's going to be so much clearer and so much more obvious to the viewer without becoming distracting. There's no real strong density here or, focal point. It's just subtly telling the subconscious, this surface is irregular. It's got bumps, it's got scales, it's got whatever. And that's why this construction here, with these big plate scales and this weird kind of gross ribbing, it reads pretty strongly. So that is the last point on texture. There is going to be more information in the exercises, so check those out. And again, be sure to look at the written content for this lesson. The page will be linked in the description of this video.